The little press room at the Hilton had emptied out hours ago. Only a handful of weary reporters lingered, nursing lukewarm coffee and the glow of a 2-hour Vegas spectacle fading in their minds. Elvis Presley, fresh from his final encore, had traded the stage's glitter for a simple black silk shirt and aviator shades, settling behind the long table as if ready to vanish into the thin Nevada air. The hum of the air conditioner and the scrape of folding chairs filled the gaps between perfunctory questions about tour dates and costume changes. Then, from the far corner, a tentative hand shot up. All heads snapped toward the newcomer, an eager-faced, fresh-faced reporter clutching a notebook like a lifeline. He swallowed, voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Presley, do you believe in life after death?" Silence crashed through the room. Pens hovered over blank pages. Even the uniformed guards by the door straightened, as if the question had paused time itself. No one in show business had dared pry into a star's private faith, yet here it was, laid bare in the harsh fluorescent light. Elvis reached up, slowly removing his shades, revealing eyes that flickered between surprise and something deeper. Curiosity, maybe even gratitude. "We've talked about sequins," he said at last, voice low but steady, "and sold-out crowds. But that's a first." He leaned forward, the silence nesting around him like a cloak, and fixed the young reporter with a gaze that cut through celebrity veneer. In that charged moment, the air crackled with expectation. Would the king of rock and roll deflect with a rehearsed quip, or bare his soul under the unblinking press room lights? No one moved. No one dared breathe. And in the pregnant pause that followed, every hardened journalist remembered why they'd come. To witness not just the legend on stage, but the man beneath the rhinestones. The haze of cigarette smoke still lingered in the low-ceilinged press room at the Hilton, even after the final flashbulb had snapped and the last note of Teddy Bear faded into the Vegas night. Rows of folding chairs sat crammed with half-empty notebooks, microphones balanced like curious insects on stands, and the polished mahogany table bore a single, sticky coffee ring, the last sign of a hurried interview. A tall floor fan whirred in the corner, struggling against the heat that seeped from the casino floor below. Elvis Presley sat at the head of the table, slumped slightly in his chair, as if the weight of the last 2 hours' performance rested on his shoulders. The rhinestone-studded jumpsuit had been shed for a simple black silk shirt and pressed slacks. No sequins, no cape, just a man in his element, yet weary. His dark hair, still damp behind the ears, curled against the collar, and a single spotlight from the corner of the room caught the rim of his aviator shades. He tilted his head, expecting the usual questions about guitars, costumes, and the next show in Atlantic City. A seasoned reporter cleared his throat. "Elvis, what's the inspiration behind your new arrangement of Hound Dog?" This was followed by another. "How do you keep your energy up for a 2-hour set night after night?" The perfunctory inquiries bounced off Elvis's practiced smile and quiet nods. The air was thick with stifled yawns and the scribble of ballpoint pens on legal pads. At the back of the room sat a young journalist, his tie slightly loose, perspiration beading on his forehead. This was his first major assignment, an all-access pass to arguably the biggest star on Earth. He had rehearsed his questions meticulously, but wanted something different, something that might truly resonate. He lifted his hand, fingers trembling. Elvis caught sight of the raised hand and tilted his head, curious. The older journalists rolled their eyes. Anyone who dared stray from showbiz trivia risked being sidelined by the king's steely disinterest. Yet the young man's gesture went unanswered by the others. Finally, One of the older men interjected, voice sharp. "Kid, stick to the script. You've got one question. Make it count." But Elvis raised a calm hand, just a gentle incline of the wrist, to still the interruption. "Let him ask," he said, voice low but carrying through the hush. All eyes pivoted to the young reporter. He swallowed, heart hammering, and leaned forward. "Mr. Presley," he began, voice wavering between reverence and fear. "Pardon the change of pace, but do you believe in life after death?" The room shuddered, as though struck by a sudden chill. Recorders clicked off. Pens paused mid-stroke. Two burly security guards at the door froze, their palms hovering near holstered radios, as though bracing for something more than misplaced adulation. For a moment that stretched like taffy, silence reigned. Elvis removed his sunglasses with deliberate slowness, placing them on the table as if setting aside a shield. His dark eyes, usually hidden, glowed with an intensity that rendered the young reporter momentarily speechless. A bead of light caught the silver edge of the choreographed cuffs and caught on the wedding band that gleamed on his left hand. He leaned back, shoulders easing from the stooped exhaustion, and folded his arms across his chest, as though wrapping himself against a sudden gust of truth. The other reporters leaned in, hungry for the unexpected, their usually impassive faces softening with curiosity. Elvis cleared his throat, a slow, contemplative sound. He stared across the table at the young man who had dared to breach the unspoken boundary of celebrity inquiry. "That's not a question you hear every night in Vegas," he said, voice low and resonant. He paused, scanning the faces in the room. Veterans of 1,000 interviews, now as vulnerable as a congregation awaiting confession. Then, without rushing, he began to speak. Not in rehearsed sound bites, but in the cadence of a man uniting stagecraft and sincerity. The press room, once a flurry of cameras and chatter, had become hallowed ground. And in that pregnant pause, the journalists felt it. The shift from spectacle to soul-searching. The moment when the king of rock and roll laid aside his crown and spoke to something far deeper than any stage could hold. The press room at the Hilton in Las Vegas buzzed like a beehive on overtime. Even after midnight, a half-dozen journalists clustered around a long, narrow table, the room still thick with the scent of perfume and stale coffee. A bank of cameras, their red tally lights blinking, pointed at the lone figure at the head of the table, Elvis Presley, who perched on the edge of his folding chair as though he might bolt for the stage at any moment. Across the carpeted floor, the low roar of the casino drifted upward through the vents, a reminder that, beyond these walls, the neon sprawl of the Strip never slept. Elvis leaned forward, hands clasped across his lap, dark hair slicked back, but a few curls rebelliously escaping at his temples. He'd just emerged moments before from a 2-hour concert of roaring guitars and high-voltage energy, the last in a grueling week of evening shows. Tonight's set had sizzled with anticipation. Teddy Bear, Suspicious Minds, Can't Help Falling in Love. All the hits delivered with a performer's precision. Yet now, in this dimly lit room, his crown of glamour felt oddly burdensome. The sequined jumpsuit replaced by a muted black silk shirt. The bravura of the stage traded for the lean lines of a man who wore exhaustion like a second skin. On the table before him lay half-filled cups of lukewarm coffee, a discarded pack of cigarettes, and notebooks bursting at the seams with hastily scrawled questions. 2 microphones on slender stands waited silently, like twins biding their turn. Reporters' pens tapped, cameras whirred, and in the low light, the tension felt almost electric. A charged anticipation for the usual round of questions about tour dates, costume changes, and the latest chart-topping single. Then, in the back corner of the room, a tentative hand rose. It belonged to a young reporter, fresh to the scene, tie askew, heart hammering under the crisp white shirt he wore much too proudly. He swallowed, pushing down the tremor in his voice, and called out, "Mr. Presley, do you believe in life after death?" The room froze. A fan of Elvis's gospel-tinged recordings might have suspected a private conviction, but no one in the cutthroat world of show business journalism had dared ask about anything so personal, so sacred. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hum of that old floor fan, its blades slicing lazy arcs through the stagnant air. The veteran reporters exchanged startled glances. One of them, a man with steel-rimmed glasses and a voice honed by decades of red carpet banter, cleared his throat and attempted to cover the moment. "Elvis, about your new single," he began, but Elvis raised a hand to forestall any interruption. The gesture, quiet but firm, commanded the room's attention more powerfully than any spotlight. Elvis removed his sunglasses and set them carefully on the table, the sudden exposure of his eyes startling. They were dark pools now glimmering with something more private than star power. A reflection of loss, of late-night doubts, of a man who had carried more than just a microphone for years. His fingers drummed an unhurried tattoo on the tabletop as he gathered his thoughts. The young reporter's question had pierced the veneer of celebrity. Suddenly the press room felt less like a circus tent and more like a silent confessional. He leaned forward, the single overhead bulb catching the curve of his nose and the line of his jaw. "That's a pretty big question," he said, voice low but clear, the hint of a country inflection threading through the sentence. He drew a slow breath, pausing so long that the recording engineers scanned their levels, uncertain whether to keep rolling. "You know," he continued, "when I was a kid in Tupelo, Mississippi, church was more than a show. It was survival. I remember once, before I could sing a proper note, I wandered off during a revival meeting, came out of the tent 2 hours later, and the world looked bigger, friendlier too, like someone had been keeping an eye on me." His gaze swept the room, and the young reporter felt his own pulse in his throat. Around them, pens were forgotten on notepads. Cameramen lowered their lenses, as if suddenly coy. Elvis kept talking. "I heard my mama's voice, callin' my name, tears in her voice. I swear to you, part of me felt she wasn't just next to me in that crowd. Felt like it was more than her. Like something, an answer. If there's a power bigger than us, it's got to be something that never lets go, even past that final curtain." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. The seasoned reporter who'd tried to change the subject wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, useless as the overhead fan continued its monotone swirl. Elvis looked back at the young journalist, tilting his head slightly. "Son," he said softly, "we spend our lives belting out love songs, hopeful, optimistic. But if love ends the moment we die, then what's the point? No, I can't prove there's life after life. But I believe, with everything I've got, that love's the thread that ties it all together. And someday, I reckon, we'll all find out on the other side." A hush more profound than any roar of applause stretched across the room. Then, quietly, a woman with a silver recorder in hand clicked it off. The young journalist blinked away tears he hadn't known were there. One of the bodyguards, a Vietnam veteran with a passport of scars and medals, lowered his bulk against the wall and whispered to his partner, voice hushed. That was more powerful than a bullet." Elvis sat back in his chair, the vulnerability still glimmering in his eyes, but also a serene acceptance. In that moment, no longer the king of rock and roll alone, but a man who had laid bare the question that most fear to ask. And for those who witnessed it, the question and its answer lingered long after the final note of "Love Me Tender" faded, which was exactly what would change their lives forever. The second set that night at the Hilton showroom began like any other. A burst of horns, a quick drum fill, and the familiar riff of Burning Love. The audience, mostly repeat ticket holders, decked in their finest Vegas attire, whooped and swayed, champagne flutes raising and toasting to the king's return. But midway through the third song, Elvis paused, eyes flicking to his band leader, in a silent signal that rippled through the musicians like a chord change. They eased out of the song, guitars muted, piano keys still. The hushed note that followed was heavier than any instrumental break could ever be. Elvis turned toward the microphone, his dark hair catching the spotlight's glare. He looked out at the crowd, that sea of faces pressed tight into the velvet seats, and spoke in a tone that brooked no interruption. "Someone asked me tonight if I believe in life after death," he began, voice low and steady, carrying easily to the furthest balcony. "I told you I sing love songs 'cause love outlasts everything, even the final curtain." A murmur of anticipation ran through the showroom as puzzled expressions replaced revelry. Then Elvis gave a nod to the keyboardist, who let his fingers drift over a simple, solemn chord. The opening of "How Great Thou Art." The familiar hymn, so different from the nightclub anthems that had filled the first half, rose softly under the spell of his introduction. "O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made." The organ's rich swell enveloped the room, its notes seeping into the walls, the ceiling, the seats, transforming the glittering showroom into something closer to a chapel. At first, the backup singers joined in, their harmonies lifting the melody. But as Elvis's silhouette rose from the mic stand, he held up a single finger once more, and the voices fell silent. The band bowed their heads, and only the organ kept its vigil behind him. Elvis closed his eyes and opened his mouth on the next stanza, his voice pure and unadorned. "Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, how great thou art, how great thou art." With each line, his vibrato trembled with heartfelt reverence. The hush in the room grew deeper than any single note could command. No one dared cough, no one dared shuffle. Even the distant clink of ice against glass seemed sacrilegious. The chandeliers glowed like constellations overhead, but the stars hung still, as if listening to the human prayer beneath them. Halfway through the bridge, Elvis's voice caught. He paused mid-phrase, the silence stretching taut across the room. He opened his eyes, wet with the memory of church revivals where he'd first heard the hymn as a boy in Tupelo. His gaze found an elderly woman in the front row, tears in her eyes, and without breaking the melody, he reached across to take her hand. She grasped his fingers as though clinging to salvation itself, and he squeezed in return, a silent communion. Then, gathering his breath, he resumed, "And when I think that God, his Son not sparing, sent him to die, I scarce can take it in." His voice rose, carried aloft by sincerity rather than any staging or artifice. The hymn's familiar lines, once relegated to Sunday services, became something charged with personal testimony, a declaration of faith bigger than any showroom spotlight. When the final verse closed, Elvis let his hands fall at his sides, and the organ faded into a lone echo that lingered in every corner. For a moment, the showroom existed outside time. Then, as if awakened from a dream, the audience stood, 1,500 souls on their feet, some weeping, many bowing heads in unison. The standing ovation that followed was neither raucous nor rapturous. It was hushed and reverent, a tide of gratitude for a moment that transcended entertainment. Elvis nodded once, lips pressing into a tight line. He did not smile. He simply bowed his head, acknowledging the unspoken bond between him and the people gathered before him. Without a word, he turned and walked off stage, leaving the organist to close the hymn with a single fading chord. Back in the wings, the air smelled of sweat and perfume, but the energy felt transformed. No longer the raw electricity of a rock show, but the warm glow of something deeper. The band members exchanged looks, struck by the uncharacteristic gravity that had overtaken their leader's performance. Crew members, usually bustling with set changes and lighting cues, stood motionless, mindful of the sacred hush that still clung to their clothes. Moments later, Elvis re-emerged in a simple white dinner jacket for the remainder of the evening. But the candles of spectacle had been replaced by something far more tender. He launched into "Can't Help Falling in Love." But the tone had shifted again. What had once been a serenade now felt like an assurance that love, like faith, is a promise that outlives any final note. And in the quiet rebirth of his own show, Elvis Presley reminded everyone present that sometimes the greatest power of a song is found not in its volume or its flash, but in its capacity to become a prayer, and to touch souls in ways that words alone could never reach. Elvis sank onto the edge of his hotel bed, the fabric of the white sheets cool against his slickened calves. Through the open window, the buzz of the Vegas Strip drifted up, neon horns and slot machines humming like cicadas in the night. Next to him, the small black-and-white television set crackled with NBC's evening news. He'd asked for quiet, privacy. Yet here was the network slicing away every nuance of last night's press conference. The childhood revival story, the trembling admissions, the question that had laid bare his private faith. All that remained was a clipped soundbite. Elvis Presley says he believes love endures beyond the grave. Elvis pressed his palm to his forehead, a groan slipping through his teeth. The anchor's voice droned on about tour dates and the next costume reveal. He flicked the remote, hard, and the screen went dark. In the hush that followed, the room felt too large, as if the walls had stretched to accommodate all the words left unsaid. Sweat beaded at his hairline, and he could taste the copper tang of frustration on his tongue. He rose, paced the short span to the dresser, and overturned a printout of headlines. Some papers sneered, "Presley's play for sympathy," "Faith or fad." Others feigned profundity, "King's cryptic creed." Not one printed the story he had bared last night, the fear of a lost child, the faith of a grieving mother, the echo of his own youth trembling in his voice. Joe Esposito rapped on the half-open door and eased in, clutching a suitcase. "You look like hell," he said gently. "I got those letters you asked for." He set the battered leather case on the bed and clicked it open. Inside lay stacks of handwritten envelopes, thick bundles of gratitude and grief. Elvis sank back onto the mattress, and Joe began pulling letters at random. The first was from a young woman in Cleveland who'd lost her husband the week before. "When you spoke about never parting, I felt my grief soften. Thank you for giving me hope." Next, a letter from a schoolteacher in Phoenix. "My sixth graders cried when they heard you say, 'Love never dies.' They needed to hear that." Elvis thumbed through until he found one in rough brown paper, edges frayed, the handwriting shaky and uneven, like a pulse beating through exhaustion. He unfolded it. "Dear Mr. Presley, I ship out for Vietnam in a week. My mom said if I die, I'll see her again one day because you said love lasts forever. Science tells me nothing returns, but your words gave me something stronger than proof. Patrick, U.S. Army, Fort Hood, Texas. Elvis's chest tightened. He ran a finger over the inked lines, the loops and jagged edges, speaking of a young man clinging to hope on the eve of combat. He's going where they kill you, Elvis whispered, voice barely above the hum of the Vegas night. And he's taking my words with him. Joe knelt beside the case. You saved their faith, he said softly. Not the papers. Elvis closed his eyes, folded the letter carefully, and pressed it to his lips. The room settled into a gentle stillness, the only sound his own heartbeat thrumming in his ears. He rose, pulled on a robe, and crossed to the small desk beneath a single lamp. From a drawer, he retrieved a black-covered journal, pages half filled with song lyrics, half with private reflections. He tucked Patrick's letter between pages as a bookmark, then opened to a fresh page and wrote in ink, To those who stand on the edge of goodbye, know that love's echo still speaks your name. He paused, fountain pen hovering, then added beneath in smaller script, Patrick, if you hear this, come home safe. I'll be waiting. With that, he closed the journal and picked up the envelope once more. In the mirror's reflection, he saw a man transformed, not merely a star in sequins, but a messenger whose words carried weight beyond ticket sales and tabloid snipes. The next morning, Elvis emerged into the fluorescent glare of the Hilton lobby, carrying the suitcase of letters. Reporters lounged nearby, smartphones primed. They lunged forward, eager for a new quote. Elvis paused, setting the case on a pedestal near the check-in desk. Without flash or fanfare, he unlatched it and let the envelopes spill onto the marbled floor. Gasps rippled through the onlookers as he spread the letters in a wide arc. Pages yellowed with longing, scrawled with midnight confessions, soaked with tears of strangers. Journalists lowered their lenses, forced to witness proof of a truth they couldn't edit out. Then Elvis turned and walked away, robe sash trailing behind him, leaving the letters for the world to ponder, his silence more eloquent than any headline. In that quiet dispersal of paper, he reclaimed the meaning of his words, ensuring that love's enduring promise would outlast every fleeting spectacle. The air in the Memphis Coliseum's backstage corridors was thick with the scent of stale coffee, sweat, and the faint tang of cigarette smoke. The brass plaques on the doors gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, each labeled with a crew member's name or star dressing room. But tonight, Elvis Presley's room was different. A small cluster of stagehands lingered in the hall, their chatter hushed, glancing toward the entrance as though waiting for something momentous. Moments earlier, one of his assistants had slipped into the room bearing a crumpled note and the wide-eyed face of a 10-year-old boy. Elvis glanced up from the mirror where he was adjusting his collar and studied the youngster narrowed by nerves and hope. The boy, skin pale yet determined, held out the note with trembling fingers. Mr. Presley, he whispered, voice cracking. My name's Tommy. I lost my folks last year in a car wreck. My aunt brings me to every show. I wrote you this. His other hand pressed a faded pencil sketch of a church and a cross against his chest. Elvis took the paper, unfolded it gently, and read, Dear Mr. Presley, last year I asked God if I'd ever see Mom and Dad again. They said you'd know. Tommy, age 10. A hush rippled through the crew. Elvis set down the note and rose from the stool, eyes soft. He walked around the vanity to stand before the boy. His tailored jumpsuit, a deep midnight blue trimmed with silver stitching, shimmered faintly in the dressing room light, but here he looked less like a superstar and more like a kindly uncle. "Tommy," Elvis said, voice low and reassuring. "I can't promise I've been anywhere past this life, but I've got something better for us." He beckoned the boy to follow him through an adjoining door. Beyond it lay the private music room, a single upright piano tucked into the corner, stacks of sheet music teetering on a side table, and a lone brass lamp casting a golden glow over the keys. Elvis seated himself at the piano bench and motioned Tommy beside him. "Here," he said, sliding a sheet of music toward the boy. The title read, "Peace in the Valley." "This song, it helped me once." Elvis's finger traced the first notes. "Why don't you play it, and I'll sing along?" Tommy perched on the edge of the bench, heart thudding. His small hands hovered uncertainly over the keys. Elvis offered a gentle nod, and the boy pressed middle C. The piano's tone was warm, resonant. As Tommy stumbled through the opening chords, hesitant but growing surer, Elvis closed his eyes and let the melody wash over him. When Tommy reached the first verse, Elvis joined in, his voice a soft baritone. "There'll be peace in the valley for me, some sweet day." Tommy's hands flowed more confidently, and together they wove the hymn's promise into the hush of the room. Each note floated between them, a shared declaration beyond words. The world outside, flashing cameras, roaring audiences, the chaos of life on tour, seemed to pause, respectful of this intimate communion. As the final chorus faded, Elvis laid his hand on Tommy's shoulder. The boy's breathing was steady now, eyes shining with the dawning realization that music could cradle his doubts. "Tommy," Elvis said, voice catching, "you asked if we'll see our families again. I can't stand here and swear I know the answer, but every time I sing this, I feel something beyond myself, like a promise in the dark." He paused, searching the boy's gaze. "If there's a place beyond this, I reckon it's where love never runs out." Tommy nodded, pressing the teddy bear's head against his chest. Elvis smiled, rising and smoothing the boy's hair. "You ready to show that promise to everyone?" he asked. They slipped back through the corridor to the stage door. A lone stagehand held it open, while the house lights still glowed dimly on the empty platform, Elvis's cue for the second set. The audience beyond waited, unaware that this night's performance would begin not with a microphone, but with a boy and the king sharing a prayer in song. Tommy's pulse thundered as they stepped into the spotlight. Elvis placed him at the center and beckoned the band leader. A hush washed over the crowd as the pianist struck the familiar chords. Then the two voices rose in harmony, echoing through the Colosseum. "There'll be peace in the valley for me, some sweet day." 10,000 fans listened, many wiping tears, their applause held in abeyance until the hymn's last note. Then, as if released from a spell, the entire house stood, every head bowed, every hand raised in gratitude for a song that had become a touchstone of hope. Backstage, the air buzzed again, with something warmer than excitement. Elvis led Tommy off the stage, the boy beaming, cheeks streaked with tears that spoke of grief eased and faith kindled. As they passed the dressing room mirrors, Elvis gave a single nod, a silent benediction to the moment they'd shared. In that night's second set, reservoirs of adoration flowed not for spectacle, but for the quiet courage of a boy and a legend who answered life's deepest question, not with certainty, but with a promise they sang together in the Valley of Peace. The last week of June 1977 found Elvis Presley both weary and resolute. He had just concluded a series of sold-out shows in Cleveland and Cincinnati, and tonight he would step onto the stage of the Market Square Arena in Indianapolis for the final performance of what history would later call his last tour. Back in his suite on the 14th floor of the nearby Omni Hotel, the Gulf of Indiana rippled silver in the moonlight beyond the window. Elvis sat at the ornate dresser mirror, his sequined jumpsuit laid out across a velvet chair. The room smelled of aftershave and stale coffee, a lingering testament to nights filled with late press conferences and early sound checks. In his hand, he held a yellowed envelope, the flap torn jaggedly, the corners softened by countless fingers unfolding it. The handwriting inside was unmistakable, block capitals penned by a soldier who had once written him before shipping out for Vietnam. Elvis's breath caught as he read the postmark, Fort Knox, Kentucky. Beneath the stamp, a mother's handwriting scrawled across the back. My son, your words gave him hope in the jungle. He fell in battle, but I know he heard your hymn and felt safe. Thank you. Mrs. Marjorie Fletcher. Elvis's chest tightened. He closed his eyes, vision swimming with the boy's story back in Houston and the tender duet with Tommy in Memphis months earlier. He pressed the letter to his heart, feeling the whipcord pull of grief and gratitude in equal measure. The initials M.F. scrawled at the bottom looked almost like a benediction. Below, the hotel corridor hummed, with the distant clatter of luggage carts and the soft murmur of stagehands awaiting his cue. He straightened the collar of his jumpsuit, checked the embroidery of gold and turquoise stitching one last time, and tucked the letter into the inner pocket of his vest. On the outside, it would remain concealed from the cameras and the press, yet close enough to his heart to remind him why he sang. The cavern of Market Square Arena lay waiting, a bowl of shadow pierced by white shafts of light. Backstage, crew members hustled, checking microphones, tuning guitars, and reassembling the drums after the opener's set. The roar of the crowd filtered through the soundproof walls, a larval thunder that promised both adulation and expectation. Elvis stepped from the wings in a whirl of camera flashes, a living comet blazing across the stage. The audience erupted in cheers that threatened to shake the rafters. He paused, allowing the roar to crest and then fall away, until only the electric anticipation remained. In his ears, he heard the faint echo of a question he had once been asked in a smoke-filled press room 3 years earlier. Do you believe in life after death? He raised a hand, silencing the audience with the same authority that had hushed 20,000 in the Astrodome. The spotlight found his profile, sharp cheekbones, glistening hair, eyes reflecting the sea of faces before him. No one spoke. The chatter faded to an expectant hush. Elvis held the microphone at his side and spoke, voice steady but charged with vulnerability. A few years ago, someone asked me, "What comes after this life?" I tried to answer then with stories and songs. Tonight, I don't have the words, but I have this. He placed a hand over his heart, the audience leaning in as though drawn by magnetism. If love is stronger than death, then those we lose are never really gone. He straightened, and the band leader deftly cued the opening chords of How Great Thou Art on the Hammond organ. The plaintive hymn flooded the arena, but Elvis raised a finger and let it drop, signaling the band to drop out until only the organ's sunlit swell remained. Then, as if guided by every letter he'd ever received, every question he'd ever dared to answer, he began to sing. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made. His voice, unamplified by backup vocals or roaring guitars, filled the space with a raw, trembling sincerity. In the front row, a group of young soldiers sat rigid, faces shining with tears. On the upper decks, longtime fans bowed their heads, some wiping cheeks streaked with mascara. Elbows leaned on shoulders in solidarity. Spouses grasped hands. Midway through the second verse, "Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee." Elvis's vibrato faltered, a single quaver that spoke of love's enduring power and its bitter toll. He straightened the microphone stand and closed his eyes, leaning into the next lines. "How great thou art! How great thou art!" The organist sustained the final chord, and for a moment, the arena existed as a vaulted cathedral with 27 strings of fluorescent light overhead. Not a breath stirred, not a foot shuffled. Then, as if awoken, the arena rose in one breathless swell, a standing ovation that felt more like a collective prayer than mere applause. Elvis bowed his head, tears glinting at the corners of his eyes, and then spoke once more, voice quivering. "I don't know what waits beyond that final curtain, but I believe in the love we leave behind, stronger than any grave." He lifted his gaze, meeting the worshipful eyes shining up at him. "Thank you for sharing this moment with me." He stepped back, and the band launched into Unchained Melody as an encore, but the arena's soul had already been transformed. When the last note faded, Elvis gave a final salute, fingers to temple, a gesture that acknowledged both his role as a star and his place as a man touched by countless stories of loss and hope. Backstage, as the lights dimmed and the crowd's cheers echoed down the corridors, Elvis slipped the letter from Mrs. Fletcher back into his vest pocket. In the quiet that followed, he whispered into the darkness, "Maybe for that question, I've sung my whole life." And in that suspended silence, more eloquent than any lyric, he carried the truth that love, once kindled, burns brighter than any stage light and endures far beyond life's final bow.